That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about Our Father, the documentary debut of Lucie Jordan, which is dropping on Netflix May 11th, 2022.
Tomorrow. All right. Well, directorial debut. This documentary is about a doctor named Donald Klein.
Very good.
All right.
No relation to Patsy.
He practiced in Indiana for a time as a fertility doctor, and basically this doctor used his own sperm to impregnate many of his patients. We find out that it's confirmed that he fathered 94.
At the time of filming, yes, and it's
94.
It's implied that there's probably more.
Probably more. That's it. He does end up going to court for sort of unrelated charges because what he did apparently is not illegal. So he does get found guilty of felony charges for like lying on like an official form. No jail time, $500 fine. That's it.
But in 2018, at the state level in Indiana, they were able to pass a law about illicit
donor insemination.
Yes.
Yeah. But there's no federal law against this.
And because of this case, they discovered 44 other physicians that have been doing
who are also doing this. It feels a little scattered in my mind because I did not think this was a well-constructed documentary.
It's not.
So I feel like, yeah, there's a lot that's left unexplained, including the period of which we think that he did this. Like, it's not really explained how long he practiced as a fertility doctor. The people who were seeing some of the victims, I shouldn't say it like it's not. They are victims. They seem to be similar in age, like late 30s to, well, I don't know. That one lady said she was 47. Mm-hmm. So he did this over the span of maybe 2 decades, but it's not clear to us.
Well, Jordan, who was previous to this a producer on in television in that series Taken at Birth, and this feels very much kind of in that exploitational kind of realm, but there are so many tangents that are more interesting that we don't explore in depth.
Yes.
And I think with the major problem with this documentary is who the main focus is.
Let's start with that. So I really didn't like this documentary because it's creating this false dramatic tension that just leads to nothing because he gets no jail time. There are no laws against what he did, and he had to pay a little measly fine. So, but the biggest problem I had is there is a woman named Jacoba
Ballard.
Mm-hmm. She's the first one to sort of understand that something's not right because this documentary is really an advertisement for the DNA testing platform 23andMe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Like, I'm ordering one to do for myself, actually. But she goes on 23andMe, gets her test results back, and she doesn't expect to have any, relation, really. She just wanted to find out where she's from because she has blonde hair, blue eyes, but the rest of her family has darker features. And then she sees that she has, initially 9 siblings. So she wants to know who these people are. And I think initially it was very annoying because sperm donors donate on the basis of anonymity. So the fact that she's so adamant about she needs to know and she doesn't appreciate being told she can't already puts a bad taste in my mouth about her. And then she's going on about how she's I don't know why it's so important that we know she's a Christian. She keeps talking about being a Christian, and it does have some relevance to Dr. Klein, but she's just obnoxious. Not because she's a Christian, but the way she's talking. Then
part of it.
She keeps saying that she's a fighter and she'll never give up, and it's girl, all you're doing is messaging people on the internet.
I mean, she very much sounds like Whitney and Team Jesus.
It's you're not a freedom fighter, girl. You weren't being attacked by police dogs. You're just on the internet messaging any person whose DNA matches yours on 23andMe, but somehow she's a crusader.
And they do this device where they show her in a red hoodie.
Oh my God.
Where the room she's sitting in, her research lab, is pasted with all kinds of miscellaneous paperwork.
The documentary starts with a sort of a warning that we are getting audio that was recorded of Dr. Klein talking to like Jacoba because she recorded their phone calls, and we do get some news footage, but most of it is dramatized. And you know I don't like that in documentaries.
Unsolved Mysteries, I think, can get away with it. But
Yeah, Unsolved Mysteries was effective. I'm just going to go through my notes because the way it's constructed is all over the place, so why not? Okay, so we hear from a nurse who worked for Dr. Klein for like 13 years. And one notable thing about what she said was that, so the sperm samples had to be fresh back then. I guess they didn't have cryogenics or whatever. So she said that where the sperm bank was like across the street from the fertility office, and they only had an hour to inseminate the patient. So this lady would carry the vial of sperm
from medical residence.
Dr. Klein told all of his patients who didn't have a sperm donor, because some of them had their husbands providing sperm samples to inseminate their wives with, but for many, they were getting sperm donors. And Dr. Klein told them that the donations were coming from doctors, like residents, and that one doctor never gave more than 3 samples. That's what he was telling them. But that wasn't true. He was giving his own. So, but for the one, but the other thing that threw me off is like, anyway.
Finish the nurse.
The nurse was carrying the sperm samples in her titty meat. Like, we see her pull the vial.
A reenactment.
Like a dramatization of the nurse pulling the vial out of her cleavage.
Well, because it had to stay warm.
Because it had to stay at room temp or body temperature. Already, I was like, this is some bullshit.
Well, I wanted to explore kind of the weird things about what did that feel like for you? Is that
there's so many things that would have been more interesting than to listen to this damn Jacoba who just knows she's special. She just knows she's special. And I'll talk about this more later. But there's this concept of, I'm going to mess up the word, but
consanguinity,
which is basically like avoiding mating with people who have similar DNA. So this is a smaller town in Indiana, and they talk about how they were concerned that maybe they had relations or dated with siblings. So I was like, ooh, this is going to go somewhere interesting. No,
not really.
No, we don't. I just wish. Okay.
The most interesting things they're vague about, because Dr. Klein had some autoimmune deficiencies that he was passing.
He had rheumatoid arthritis.
He did, but they all have these vague, they just keep saying autoimmune disorders, but nobody really spells anything out, which was interesting. But
okay.
Again, interesting enough to why didn't we pursue that?
So we know from the synopsis, like if you're going to watch this documentary, you know it's about a doctor who used his own sperm to impregnate patients. But so we already know that, but within this documentary, the section where it is explained like how they knew and how they're connecting the dots is so underwhelming. It's like 90 seconds. It's like boom, boom, pow, he did it. And then when when confronting him, he's like, yeah, I did it. Okay. I mean, so then they're trying to create this dramatic tension with music and the potential for something more, but really there's nothing more.
And showing some hand-wringing with the children, looking upset, that doesn't play very well.
Okay, the first thing that I wish this documentary or the documentarian would have done is get anthropologists and sociologists to talk about kinship and how in modern Western culture, we sort of have these defined kinship roles. So like, if we have the same mom and dad, biologically, you're my sibling, that kind of thing. But really,
the meaning you attach to it.
It's about the meaning you attach to it, but then it's so interesting to hear because we don't have all 94 people, but we have like 10 maybe talking, and several of the 10 really attach a lot of meaning to their sibling, like that's my brother. Mm-hmm. You just met him 2 days ago, girl. How have you attached so much meaning to this person? And then some of them are saying like, it was so devastating to know that the person who raised me is not my father. And it's like, that is your father. He raised you and loved you.
Or frustrating to hear these men that were fathers that are like, they've taken everything from me.
It would have been so much more interesting to have these people and have psychologists talk about what this means and how they can get over it. Because ultimately, knowing that this doctor really didn't pay a penance for what he did is very unsatisfying. So really, it would have been more satisfying as the audience to know that these people are working through this sort of, they were victimized.
They were, yes.
More so the parents were victimized.
But it also feels like things are way blown out of proportion.
Yeah.
Like, this is the worst thing that, like, one of these women's, like, this is a child. One of the worst things that has ever happened to me. Well, this was out of your control, clearly.
Okay.
And if you're, technically, I feel like you're lucky if that's the worst thing that ever happened to you.
Well, sure. I agree with you, but I think,
I'm more interested in hearing about from the mothers who technically, I think, were sexually assaulted.
Yeah, for sure. And we can get into that a little more. But then probably the most interesting tangent that's touched on that really goes nowhere is this idea. So we're told that Dr. Klein often recites like this Bible quote, Jeremiah 1:5, which I couldn't tell you what it is, except it's something about like, I knew you before you were born or something. And then we find out that there's a religious cult called Quiverful.
Mm-hmm. That there was some connection to.
Well, their mantra is Jeremiah 1:5, and Jacoba keeps saying that she kept filing reports with the Attorney General trying to investigate this doctor, and they kept telling her no. Like, we're not going to do anything, or they won't respond to her. So she was doing more research regarding some of the people who she had contacted at the Attorney General's office, and she finds out that one of them is affiliated with Quiverful. So, of course, the documentary is not saying this, but as the audience, we're thinking, so maybe Dr. Klein is part of this cult? And that, because then they explain the cult is like, it's basically like...
The Handmaid's Tale.
They're trying to create the perfect race, which is like these white people.
The Nazis.
And they encourage all their members to get in positions of power, like politics. And so we're supposed to speculate that maybe there are people in like the Attorney General's office who are part of this cult, and that's why no one's investigating Dr. Klein.
But it's dropped in such a way where it feels like they're trying to avoid libel.
Right.
And it feels like that a statement that's made in a courtroom where the judge tells the jury to disregard that last statement. That's about how that feels plopped in there.
So it just is like, why even mention it if you can't go anywhere with it? There's nothing to substantiate it.
Because that's what, and to me, what was interesting where this really drops the ball is one of these women talks. It's a very brief statement about how they noticed like it's all these white babies, and and even Jacoba says something about he's trying to create the perfect Aryan race, which we wrote.
Well, I think it's funny because I'm always shady, but first of all these people are not that attractive. Well, one is. And then they all have like these health issues. So I find it funny that if the idea is to create this perfect Aryan race, they're all kind of jacked up.
But what I wanted is, how does that make you feel as a white person to know that you were kind of bred? Like, the idea is there that you have an awareness that you might have been bred for that. And how does it make you feel? And
we do get one like 30-second snippet in a kitchen where several of them are talking about that.
But not to any great length.
No, you're right. But we do get one of them sort of like visibly upset that this could have been a thing that happened.
Yes, but again, that's like in Boys from Brazil, if you got one of those little Hitler clones to be aware of what he was and sit down and talk to him. What would you ask him?
I agree with you. It would have been so much more interesting to delve into like the possibility of that being a reality and how that would make these people feel. Okay. The sexual assault part of it is so creepy to think, and one of the victims talks about it eloquently, saying that...
One of the mothers.
The mother, saying that this man, this doctor, because these samples had to be fresh, so he would consult with them and say, okay, it's time to inseminate you. He would take his ass to a different room, masturbate into a container, and then insert it in these women in very short time. So they were explaining like, that's a sexual act. Like, he had to arouse himself, and then I was sitting in this chair with my legs spread. He has seen my vagina. Now he's over here masturbating. Certainly there's some erotic sexual tone to that act. Then he comes back in short time, which means that he's still like those hormones that are flooding your body after you have an orgasm are still present when he is inseminating me. So there's no way that this cannot have some sexual component to it.
It's definitely a kink for this person. And also, his first excuse was that he only did it when a medical resident wasn't available when this host was there to be inseminated. And he's like, not more than 10 times. And then the numbers keep going.
I just wanted, we are made to explain because we do have someone from the Attorney General's office talking, saying that, he's like, I agree this is messed up, but there is no law that we can use to prosecute this man. So...
I thought he was from the county.
Was he from the county?
But anyway.
Some legal person was explaining that who was involved, that they couldn't bring charges against him because what he's doing is not technically illegal. But then to the audience, I'm not a moron, and to me it seemed like this seems like it would be illegal. Maybe not for I can see how it could be murky for the patients who accepted a donor sample, so they don't know who it is.
Right.
So I could see how, well, since you don't know who it is, then I guess the fact that it's your doctor can't be that bad. But for the ones who thought oh, this is my husband's sperm you're putting into me, and then you lied, that at least has to be fraud. And Jacoba does say, how can it not be fraud? And I did agree with her, but then the documentary doesn't explain, I needed more, a better legal breakdown than it's just not illegal.
Again, it's another one of those documentaries where it's a hot, provocative story, and it's just kind of plopped in front of us. Isn't that weird and creepy?
What was the last one we did that was just like that?
Bad Vegan.
Oh, Bad Vegan.
But I was kind of suspicious seeing Jason Blum as one of the producers on. It's a Blumhouse production. It's well, what are you doing making documentaries that are clearly slanted and presented in a certain way that... this isn't a horror film. To me, we needed a sober, clear... explanation and a vivisection of this
and a breakdown of what this means for these people, because what's done is done. This doctor got away with it. So what does this mean for these people now that they have to sit in this truth? We get recorded calls from Dr. Klein between he and Jacoba, and several of them he's calling her, because we also get this one reporter from some Fox News channel in the local channel. And she's the one who kind of breaks the story. But Dr. Klein's calling Jacoba saying, you need to stop this, because if this gets released, it'll ruin my marriage. And I kept thinking, who cares about Dr. Klein's feelings?
Well, he's obviously a manipulative person.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the neurobiologist?
Okay. Another thing that I think would have been a great angle is there is a woman, a neurobiologist, who is married to... it wasn't clear to me, but I believe her husband is a physician as well and was a colleague of Dr. Klein's. And for most of the documentary, they're just talking I knew him, he didn't seem like a bad guy. And then the woman, the neurobiologist, is he's arrogant. You could tell she can't stand this man. And she's very eloquent about it and very disgusted, look on her face. And then the gag is, we find out almost towards the end of the documentary that Dr. Klein inseminated her.
She had twins.
With his sperm, she ended up having twins, and one of the twins we hear from her. And I thought she had sort of the best, sort of thoughts about it, saying that there's such conflict because on one hand, she hates this man. Beyond what he did to her, she just can't stand his ass. She thinks he's arrogant, and she cites an example of her area of expertise is child development and all that. And then that Dr. Klein would try to tell her he knew more about that than her. So she can't stand his ass. But then what he did to her resulted in these two girls who she loves more than anything. And I thought that would have been so much more interesting to have that lady be the focus, not Jacoba, who every time we see her ass, she's talking about how she's a Christian, how nothing will ever stop her. She's going to get Dr. Klein. And every time there's a new pop-up on 23andMe, we see her.
She's on it.
She's on it, messaging them. Girl, all that effort and you being a crusader, and it didn't amount to anything.
Also, the neurobiologist being Jewish, I think it was interesting as well, because he made comments to her about how only Christians would be saved.
Oh, right. Yeah. Speaking of that,
and her own daughter was treated by him.
Yes, but the daughter doesn't divulge whether or not he impregnated her, but she does say that he was also her daughter and how uncomfortable she felt knowing that that's her dad who's like all up in her reproductive system. Then I had this thought, not to be, snarky, but I just thought, thinking about Jacoba, like all this religious dialogue she keeps spitting, and then I was thinking like, well, maybe God wanted this to happen to you.
Okay, what's frustrating is watching someone clearly unaware of how they operate in the world, because she is able to, she's able to clearly see that Dr. Klein is nutty and how that makes other religious people look bad. But, are you seeing how you're acting or behaving and your self-righteousness and
Let's not get too deep into that. But I agree. It was interesting to watch someone who's self-aware enough to know that him using religion as like a ploy to convince people that his behavior is appropriate. She can see that, but then she doesn't see that all the crazy shit she's talking doesn't make sense either.
Or that other people might think that certain things she says are equally,
Well, it just seems so contradictory. Like,
yes, there's the rub. But
speaking of the health issues, so yes, there's constant mention of like all these siblings have health issues, but they're very vague. We do get an understanding that one of them has like a blood clotting disorder, and then many of them have like digestive and colon issues. And then we learned that Dr. Klein had rheumatoid arthritis, and that if someone with that condition tried to donate sperm, they would have been turned away.
Denied, yeah.
Jacoba says something at the very end that I thought was funny. She says, "I want zero relationship with him. He is not my father."
I thought that's not Jacoba.
Who says that?
That's another.
Anyway, whichever sibling said that, I thought that should have been your first thought. That because they're so invested in this idea, and it's like you're gonna let this man who did this really inappropriate thing define your life. Like you didn't even know about this until 2 days ago, and now you're on camera. Like, I'm devastated, and I can appreciate that learning that would be very upsetting, but It's just so interesting that people would get on camera knowing that they should probably have a well-formed thought about it, would still just act like this is going to define me and I'm ruined and I'm going to spend all my energy trying to do something to this old ass man, and then when it just turns into nothing. I just think like it was very unsatisfying. I almost feel like, I do think that this would have served better as like a, maybe if not a movie, like a mini series. But more surrounding Quiverful.
Again, we have a documentarian that is not asking the hard-hitting questions and dancing around things. Because even Jacoba says the first time they all sat down with Dr. Klein, he wanted to know what they did for occupation. Like he was measuring what they did, and it's like, well, all these kids ended up just staying in town, it sounds like. But
yeah, that's interesting because Jacoba says she felt like he was ranking us to see what his offspring amounted to, but then we don't get the follow-up. Like, yeah, what are y'all doing? Y'all stayed in this small town. You seem to have a lot of time focused on this. Like,
yeah, I wanted to know what her day job was. Anyway, it's not like this is a scenario that hasn't been explored in film, in lots of genre narratives, such as that recent Pierce Brosnan film, False Positive. Mm-hmm. That's a plot point in there.
I'd recommend watching that over this.
There's a Canadian film called Starbuck from 2011 that was remade with Vince Vaughn as delivery man about a sperm donor who sired like 500 kids. And 100 or so of them file a lawsuit to find out who their father was. I didn't like either of those films, but that was more interesting. And every time I hear something like this, I think of my grandmother had a thing for Mary Higgins Clark, the murder mystery writer. And she had a book called The Cradle Will Fall about a doctor. This is probably late 70s, early 80s, about a doctor that was inseminating women without them knowing. And he had to kill one of them because he was about to be outed. And it was due to a race issue because the doctor was Asian.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Blumhouse should have made this a horror film based on true events and have it revolve around Quiverful and this idea of eugenics. That would have been intriguing.
Well, yeah, it's like, so I'm assuming there are not a lot of black people in this small town in Indianapolis who in the late 70s, early 80s would have gone to this person. but again, like, there's a bigger picture. There are bigger questions to ask that just are all, ignored.
I found it very unsatisfying. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're interested, just read the Wikipedia entry about Dr. Donald Klein. What would you give it?
1.5.
I would give it 2 out of 5. Anything else?
No.
Listen to our podcast. Bye.